how cowboys survived scorching days and freezing nights. Imagine yourself riding slowly across the American Southwest in the 19th century. The sun is already high, though the morning began cool. Your horse moves at an easy pace beneath you. Its hooves press into pale dust, leaving a trail that disappears almost as quickly as it forms. Ahead, the land seems to stretch without end. Low hills sit beneath a wide blue sky, and scattered shrubs break the emptiness here and there. There is little shade. There is even less water. Yet this is not an unusual journey. For a working cowboy, days like this could be part of ordinary life. The word cowboy often brings to mind open plains, cattle, saddles, campfires, and long rides. But many cattle workers in the American West also traveled through dry country where the weather could change with surprising speed. In the deserts and high desert regions of places such as Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California, the same landscape could feel almost unbearably hot during the afternoon and sharply cold after sunset. The difference could be startling. A man might spend hours sweating beneath a bright summer sun, only to wrap himself in a blanket several hours later while cold air settled over the ground. There was no air conditioning. There were no insulated sleeping bags. There were no weather apps warning of a sudden drop in temperature. There was simply experience. A cowboy learned to watch the sky, understand his horse, protect his water, choose a campsite carefully, and make use of whatever shelter the land provided. And slowly, almost without thinking about it, he learned to live with the desert's rhythm. The heat belonged to the day. The cold belonged to the night. And between them was a narrow period of twilight when the whole world seemed to change. To understand how cowboys endured this environment, it helps to begin before the journey itself. Because surviving desert weather was not simply about being tough. It was about preparation. A careless traveler could become exhausted quickly. A thirsty horse could become dangerously weak. A poorly chosen campsite could leave a rider exposed to wind for hours. The men who worked cattle in these regions depended heavily on practical knowledge passed through experience. They knew that the desert was not simply an empty place. It had its own patterns. Water collected in certain places after rain. Animals followed familiar routes. Some plants offered limited moisture or shade. Certain rocky formations blocked the wind. Dry washes could look harmless under a clear sky, but become dangerous channels after storms far away. Even the position of the sun mattered. A rider who understood where the shadows would fall later in the afternoon could choose a better place to rest. A rider who ignored those details might spend the hottest part of the day wishing he had planned differently. So picture yourself preparing for a long ride. The morning air is cool. Your horse stands quietly nearby, its breath faintly visible in the early chill. You check the saddle. You check the cinch. You make sure your water supply is secure. The leather has a familiar smell, mixed with dust and the dry scent of the surrounding vegetation. The horse shifts its weight. Somewhere in the distance, a bird calls. For a few moments, the desert feels almost gentle. This is one of the quietest times of day, and it is also one of the most useful. The morning coolness could make work easier before the full force of the sun arrived. Cowboys did not necessarily follow one universal schedule. Ranches, cattle drives, seasons, terrain, and individual circumstances all affected the working day. But experienced cattle workers understood the value of using the cooler parts of the day whenever practical. In hot country, the morning could be precious. The sun rose, shadows shortened, the temperature climbed, and eventually, even a simple ride became work. The horse felt the heat too. A horse carrying a rider and equipment had to regulate its body temperature through sweating, breathing, and other natural processes. Heavy exertion in extreme heat could become dangerous. So the rider had another responsibility. He had to notice the animal. Was the horse breathing unusually hard? Was it reluctant to move? Was it sweating heavily? Was it beginning to stumble? A good horseman paid attention. The desert did not care whether a rider was tired. It certainly did not care whether he was in a hurry. If the animal suffered, the journey could become much more difficult for everyone. Water was therefore more than a comfort. It was part of the entire rhythm of travel. Before modern roads and reliable water systems, knowing where water could be found was essential for people, horses, cattle, and other livestock. This was one reason trails, ranches, settlements, and cattle routes were often shaped by geography. A map could show a river. Experience could tell you whether that river was actually useful. A dry-looking country might contain a spring hidden among rocks. A place that appeared promising might contain only a shallow pool after a recent rain. Some water sources were seasonal, others could become contaminated, and some were separated by long distances. For a cowboy traveling with cattle, the problem became even larger. A herd could consume enormous quantities of water. The needs of hundreds or even thousands of animals could not be solved with a small canteen. This is why cattle drives depended on routes with access to water and grazing. The famous long-distance cattle drives of the 19th century were not simply journeys across empty land. They were carefully managed movements through landscapes that could support animals along the way. Cowboys had to think about grass. They had to think about water. They had to think about weather. And they had to think about distance. A desert crossing was therefore not just a matter of riding forward. It was a matter of managing resources. As the morning slowly arrives in your imagined journey, the coolness begins to disappear. The shadows beneath the horse grow shorter. The light becomes stronger. The landscape changes without actually moving. The same rocks that looked gray in the early morning now seem pale and almost white. The air begins to shimmer. This is where desert heat becomes difficult to understand if you have only experienced humid summer weather. Desert regions can be extremely hot, but the air is often much drier than in humid climates. Sweat can evaporate more readily in dry air. That evaporation can help cool the body. But it also means that a person may lose significant amounts of water without always realizing how much has been lost. A cowboy could therefore become dehydrated while still feeling capable of continuing. Thirst was a warning, but it was not the only warning. Fatigue mattered, headache mattered, dizziness mattered, confusion mattered. Experience taught people to recognize when a day's work needed to slow down. This is one reason the image of the endlessly riding cowboy can be misleading. Real cattle work was tiring. There were long periods of waiting. There were slow rides. There were moments when animals needed to be gathered or watched, rather than pushed rapidly across the landscape. The cowboy's job was not simply to sit on a horse and ride toward the horizon. It involved ropes, livestock, saddles, fences, camps, repairs, meals, equipment, weather, and long hours of observation. And in desert country, every task was influenced by temperature. Even clothing mattered. The clothing of working cowboys was practical rather than simply decorative. A broad-brimmed hat could provide shade for the face and neck. Long sleeves protected the skin from sunlight, brush, and rough vegetation. Trousers protected the legs while riding and moving through thorny country. Boots protected the feet and helped secure the rider in the stirrups. A bandana or neckerchief could serve several practical purposes, including protection from dust and sun. The familiar cowboy hat was not merely a symbol that later became famous in films. Headwear designed to provide shade was useful in an environment where the sun could remain intense for hours. The exact styles varied widely. There was no single uniform cowboy outfit. Working clothing depended on region, occupation, personal preference, cost, and time period. A ranch hand in Texas might not dress exactly like a cattle worker in Arizona or New Mexico. But practical protection from sun and dust was important everywhere. The hat created a small island of shade. It was not much. But in the middle of a bright desert afternoon, even a small amount of shade could feel valuable. Picture yourself stopping beneath a cottonwood tree near a water source. The shade is uneven. Sunlight slips through the leaves and falls across the ground in shifting patches. Your horse lowers its head. The reins rest loosely in your hand. For a short while, nobody needs to hurry. There may be a few sounds. The insects, the movement of leaves, the quiet breathing of the horse. Perhaps the distant lowing of cattle. This kind of pause could be more important than it first appears. Rest reduced the demand placed on the body. It also allowed the horse to recover, and it offered an opportunity to drink carefully. Water management was a constant concern. A person could not simply assume that another reliable source was a few miles away. That uncertainty shaped travel. The safest journey was often one in which the traveler already understood where the next water source should be. Knowledge of the landscape was therefore a kind of equipment. It could not be seen hanging from a saddle, but it could be just as important as a rope or a bedroll. Cowboys learned from other workers. They learned from ranchers. They learned from local residents. They learned from indigenous peoples, whose knowledge of particular landscapes was often far older than the arrival of American cattle ranching. This part of Western history is important. The American West was not an empty wilderness waiting for cowboys. Long before cattle drives and ranches expanded across the region, indigenous nations had lived in these landscapes for centuries and developed detailed knowledge of water, plants, animals, seasons, and travel routes. Later cattle workers sometimes benefited from knowledge that had been developed through generations of indigenous experience. The West was a landscape already known and inhabited. The cowboy became one participant in a much older human relationship with the land. And the land itself remained indifferent to all of them. By early afternoon, the heat could become oppressive. The sun stood high overhead. The horse's shadow became small. The air smelled of dust, dry grass, leather, and warm earth. There might be almost no breeze. The landscape seemed to hold its breath. This was the time when efficient movement mattered. A cowboy did not need to prove anything to the sun. He needed to get the work done without exhausting himself or his animals. When possible, the pace could be moderated. Horses were allowed to walk rather than constantly gallop. Cattle were not pushed unnecessarily fast. A herd that became overheated could lose condition, and weakened livestock created problems later. For cattlemen, the health of the animals was closely connected to the success of the entire operation. This practical concern shaped daily decisions. A cowboy might spend hours moving slowly. From a distance, it could look almost peaceful. But there was concentration behind that quietness. A herd had to stay together. Stray cattle needed to be noticed. The landscape had to be watched. A rider had to keep track of the position of the sun and the general direction of travel. And all of this happened while the body was gradually losing water. The desert did not always announce danger dramatically. Often it worked quietly. A little more thirst, a little more fatigue, a little more heat. Then another mile. Then another. The danger could come from accumulation rather than sudden violence. That was why experience mattered. A person who had spent years working outdoors could recognize small changes that a newcomer might ignore. The horse could provide clues, too. An experienced rider watched its ears, gait, breathing, and willingness to respond. The animal was not simply transportation. It was a partner in the work. The relationship between horse and rider was practical, but it could also become deeply familiar. A cowboy spent many hours with the same animals. He learned their habits. He knew which horse disliked certain terrain. He knew which one was nervous around cattle. He knew which one was steady. He knew how each animal responded to heat. The horse knew the rider's movements as well. A slight shift of weight, a change in the reins, a familiar pressure from the legs. Much of the communication could happen quietly. And quiet communication was useful in a landscape where unnecessary movement cost energy. Eventually, afternoon began to soften. The sun moved lower. Shadows stretched across the ground. The temperature did not immediately become cold, but the worst heat began to release its grip. This was another useful period. The evening could become active again. Livestock could be moved. Camps could be established. Water could be collected. Food could be prepared. And then something remarkable happened. The same desert that had felt unbearably hot only a few hours earlier began to cool. Rapidly. This is one of the defining characteristics of many dry environments. Water vapor in the atmosphere helps slow the loss of heat after sunset. In very dry air, the ground can lose heat quickly through radiation, and temperatures can fall substantially once the sun disappears. The exact temperature change depended on location, season, elevation, cloud cover, wind, and other conditions. But the contrast could be dramatic. A person who had spent the afternoon searching for shade could later find himself searching for warmth. The cowboy's clothing and equipment, therefore, had to serve another purpose. The same man who needed protection from sunlight during the day also needed insulation after dark. A bedroll became important. A blanket became important. A coat could become important. The familiar cowboy image of a man wrapped in a blanket beside a small campfire reflects a real practical problem, although the details varied greatly from one person and situation to another. The bedroll was not a luxury. It was a portable sleeping arrangement. A cowboy's bedroll might include blankets and other bedding, often protected or rolled into a compact package for transport. The exact contents varied. So did the quality. A wealthy ranch hand and a poorly paid trail worker did not necessarily carry the same equipment, but the basic principle was simple. At night, the ground could become cold. The air could become colder. And a person who had been comfortable in the afternoon needed protection after sunset. Picture yourself sitting beside a small fire. The day's heat is gone. The sky above you is enormous. Stars appear one by one. Without city lights, the night can feel much deeper than modern people often imagine. The Milky Way may stretch across the darkness like a pale cloud. The fire makes a small circle of light. Outside that circle, the desert disappears into shadow. Your horse stands nearby. Its outline is barely visible. Occasionally, you hear a hoof move against the ground. Perhaps a piece of leather creaks as the animal shifts. The fire crackles. The smell of smoke settles into your clothing. The warmth reaches your hands, but only your hands. The rest of the night remains cold. A fire could help, but it was not a complete solution. It required fuel. In some desert environments, firewood could be scarce. Dry shrubs and fallen branches might provide some fuel, but a large, roaring campfire was not always possible. Cowboys, therefore, had to work with what the landscape offered. They might choose a campsite near natural protection. A rock formation could block wind. A depression in the ground could offer some shelter. A group of trees could provide limited protection. The choice of campsite was another part of survival knowledge. Wind mattered greatly. A cold desert night with still air could be uncomfortable. A cold night with strong wind could be much worse. Wind increased heat loss from the body and could make a person feel colder even when the air temperature itself had not changed. A well-chosen camp could therefore make the night more manageable. The ground mattered too. Sleeping directly on cold ground allowed body heat to escape. That is why bedding and ground insulation were important. A blanket beneath the body could provide some protection. A bedroll could create a barrier between the sleeper and the earth. Clothing could be layered. A coat could be pulled close. A hat could remain on the head. Small practical decisions accumulated. None of them looked heroic. Together, they made the difference between a tolerable night and a miserable one. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about surviving the desert. Survival was rarely one dramatic action. It was a collection of ordinary decisions. Drink when water is available. Do not waste it. Protect the horse. Use shade. Avoid unnecessary exertion. Carry bedding. Watch the weather. Choose a good campsite. Keep equipment in working order. Pay attention to the land. These habits could become almost automatic. A cowboy who had spent enough time outdoors might not consciously think through every decision. He simply knew what to do. The knowledge became part of the routine. The routine became part of life. And life in the West was not always spent far from civilization. Cowboys worked on ranches, farms, cattle operations, and trails that varied enormously in their isolation. Some slept in bunkhouses. Some lived in ranch buildings. Some spent nights in temporary camps. Some worked long cattle drives where sleeping outdoors was unavoidable. There was no single cowboy experience. The popular image often combined several different periods and occupations into one character. Real history was more varied. A cowboy could be a hired ranch hand. He could be a trail worker. He could be a young man seeking wages. He could be Mexican or Mexican-American, black, indigenous, or white. The Spanish and Mexican traditions of horse and cattle work strongly influenced the development of American cowboy culture. The vaquero tradition in particular shaped riding techniques, equipment, cattle handling, and vocabulary across the Southwest. So when we imagine a cowboy preparing for a cold desert night, we should imagine a diverse working population rather than a single, stereotyped figure. The work itself demanded skill. And one of the most important skills was patience. Cattle did not always behave as expected. Weather did not follow schedules. Horses could become tired. Water sources could be farther away than remembered. A storm could appear over distant mountains. A trail could become difficult. Patience allowed a worker to respond rather than panic. This was especially useful in desert country. The landscape could seem empty, but it was full of small signals. Clouds gathered in the distance. Wind changed direction. Birds moved differently. Animals became restless. The smell of rain could sometimes reach the air before the storm arrived. In the Southwest, summer thunderstorms could develop rapidly, producing intense rainfall over localized areas. A dry wash might remain dry for days and then carry dangerous water after storms upstream. Cowboys who understood this landscape learned not to treat a dry riverbed as automatically safe. The desert had another rhythm. Rain could be rare, but when it came, it could come quickly. The same land that demanded careful water conservation could suddenly contain too much water in the wrong place. This contrast was another lesson in Western travel. Never assume the landscape will behave exactly as it looks. The quietest valley could change. The brightest sky could be followed by a storm, and the hottest afternoon could become a cold night. By now, the imagined camp has grown quiet. The fire has burned lower. The horses are resting. The cattle have settled. Above you, the stars remain clear. You pull the blanket closer. The desert no longer resembles the place you crossed earlier that day. The heat is gone. The rocks that seemed almost too hot to touch are now cold. The breeze moves across the ground. Somewhere beyond the circle of firelight, a night animal makes a brief sound. Then silence returns. This was the other side of cowboy life. Not the bright afternoon. Not the dust rising behind a herd. Not the long trail disappearing toward the horizon. But the quiet hours when a working man lay beneath a dark sky and waited for morning. Sleep could be difficult in such conditions. The ground was uneven. The cold could wake you. The wind could disturb the bedroll. The fire might die down. Animals could make noise. A cowboy might have responsibilities during the night, especially while working with livestock. On cattle drives, night watches could be necessary. Cattle could become restless. A herd might move. In some circumstances, riders took shifts watching the animals. The night was therefore not always a complete period of rest. Sometimes it was another part of the working day. A man might sleep for a few hours and then rise to take his turn. The body adapted as best it could. After a while, the darkness began to fade. The eastern horizon became slightly lighter. The coldest part of the night often occurred near dawn or around sunrise, depending on local conditions. Your blanket feels heavy. The fire is almost gone. The horse lifts its head. Birds begin to stir. And then, very slowly, the first light appears. As the morning slowly arrives, the desert changes once again. The same land that had been cold and dark begins to warm. The rocks catch the first light. The shadows lengthen toward the west. The sky changes from black to deep blue, then to softer colors near the horizon. The horse begins to move. The day is starting again, and the cycle begins again. Cool morning, rising heat, bright afternoon, falling temperature, cold night. Then morning. For the cowboy, this cycle was not merely something to observe. It shaped the entire working life. The desert demanded that a person live according to its rhythms rather than against them. That is perhaps why the most useful lessons were simple. A cowboy learned to respect shade. He learned to respect water. He learned to respect distance. He learned to respect the horse beneath him. And eventually, he learned to respect the cold as much as the heat. Because desert survival was not about defeating the environment. It was about understanding it. And as another morning spreads quietly across the landscape, there is still much more to learn about the small habits, tools, clothing, camps, food, horses, and routines that allowed working cowboys to cross some of the harshest country in the American West. The trail continues with the rising sun, and somewhere ahead, beyond the pale hills and the long morning shadows, another day's journey is waiting. The morning is still young when the work begins again. The fire has almost disappeared into a bed of gray ash. The cold that settled over the camp during the night has not completely lifted, even though the eastern sky is beginning to brighten. You find yourself sitting up beneath a heavy blanket, listening to the first small sounds of the new day. A horse shifts nearby. Leather creaks. A bit of dust moves across the ground in a faint breeze. For a few moments, the desert seems almost motionless. Then the sun touches the tops of the distant hills, and slowly, warmth returns. This quiet transition from cold to heat was one of the rhythms that shaped life in the dry country of the American West. A person who worked outdoors had to live through both extremes. The same clothing that felt necessary before sunrise could become uncomfortable a few hours later. The same blanket that protected a sleeping body at night might be rolled tightly and strapped behind the saddle before the morning ride. Nothing was simply one thing. Everything had several purposes. A blanket was bedding. It was insulation. It could become a temporary cover. It could be folded beneath the body. A coat protected against cold. It could also block wind. A hat shaded the face. It could also help keep dust away. The equipment carried by a cowboy was therefore carefully connected to the realities of travel. Weight mattered. A horse could carry only so much. Every unnecessary object became another burden. But leaving behind something important could create a much larger problem later. This was especially true on long journeys. Imagine preparing for several days away from a ranch. You cannot bring a modern suitcase filled with spare clothes, food, and equipment. Everything must fit onto an animal or wagon. The saddle itself carries weight. There may be blankets, personal clothing, food, cooking equipment, rope, tools, and other supplies. Water containers may be needed. A rifle or revolver might be carried depending on the individual's occupation and period. The exact equipment varied greatly. There was no universal cowboy packing list, but the principle remained the same. Carry what you need, leave what you do not, and make sure the things you carry can survive dust, heat, rain, and constant movement. Leather was everywhere. Saddles were made from leather. Bridles were leather. Reins were leather. Belts, boots, and other equipment often relied on it as well. Leather could become stiff when dry. It could crack if neglected. It could become wet during rain. So equipment maintenance was part of ordinary life. A cowboy might spend time cleaning, oiling, repairing, or adjusting gear. A broken strap was not merely inconvenient. If a saddle failed during a difficult ride, it could create a serious problem. The desert offered little opportunity to stop at a modern store and replace a missing piece. Repair skills mattered. A person working far from a town needed to be able to solve small problems himself. A loose buckle, a torn strap, a damaged rein, a worn boot. These were ordinary problems. And ordinary problems became important when you were 20 or 30 miles from help. The same practical attitude applied to clothing. Cowboys often wore clothing that could tolerate hard use. The famous blue jeans associated with the West became particularly useful because denim was durable. Work trousers needed to survive long hours in the saddle and contact with rough terrain. They were not designed specifically for comfort in extreme heat, but they offered protection from brush, dust, and the constant friction of riding. The saddle itself could create another problem. Hours of riding placed pressure on the body. A rider had to learn how to sit properly. The horse's movement passed through the saddle into the rider's body. An inexperienced rider could become sore very quickly. A skilled rider learned to move with the horse rather than fighting every motion. That saved energy. It also made long journeys more manageable. The horse's pace mattered. Walking was often the basic rhythm. A horse could trot or gallop when necessary, but constant fast movement would consume more energy and could tire both horse and rider. On long cattle drives, maintaining a steady pace was often more useful than moving as quickly as possible. The herd itself had its own rhythm. Cattle might move slowly. They might stop to graze. They might spread out. A cowboy had to keep them moving without creating unnecessary stress. This required patience. Sometimes, the most effective work involved riding around the edges of a herd rather than directly through it. A cowboy could use his position, movement, voice, and horse to influence the direction of cattle. The work had an almost quiet geometry. A rider moved left. The cattle adjusted. Another rider moved right. The herd changed shape. A few animals drifted away. Someone guided them back. Then the group continued. In the distance, dust rose from hundreds of hooves. The air smelled of cattle, dry grass and warm earth. The sound was low and continuous. Hooves, bells were used, occasional calls from riders, the movement of animals across the ground. It was not a silent journey, but it was not always loud either. Much of the time, the work settled into a steady background rhythm. That rhythm could continue for hours. And in hot country, the timing of those hours mattered. The early morning was valuable. The late afternoon was valuable. The middle of the day was often the hardest. This does not mean every cowboy simply stopped working at noon. Cattle had to be managed. Journeys had to continue. Ranch duties could not always wait for comfortable temperatures. But experienced workers understood that heat changed the way work should be done. A task that might be easy at 8 in the morning could become exhausting at 2 in the afternoon. The body had limits. The horse had limits. The cattle had limits. The desert simply made those limits more obvious. There was also the problem of reflected heat. Dry ground, pale rocks, and sandy surfaces could reflect sunlight upward. The cowboy was not only under the sun, he was surrounded by surfaces that had been warmed by it. A hat could provide shade, but the rest of the body remained exposed. Long sleeves could protect the skin. A neckerchief could cover the neck. Some workers wore loose clothing that allowed air to circulate. The precise choices differed, but the general goal was to balance protection and comfort. There is a common modern assumption that the best way to deal with heat is simply to wear as little clothing as possible. In a dry environment, that is not always practical. Clothing can protect skin from direct sunlight and reduce exposure to wind and dust. The goal was not necessarily to expose the body to the sun. It was to create a manageable layer between the body and the environment. This principle can be seen in many traditional desert cultures around the world. People living in hot, dry climates have long used clothing, shade, timing, and water management to reduce heat stress. Cowboys working in the Southwest were part of this much larger human experience. They were not inventing ways to live in the desert from nothing. They were adapting to a landscape where people had already developed many forms of environmental knowledge. The horse itself also required attention. In dry country, watering a horse was one of the most important parts of travel. A horse that had worked hard needed time to cool before being watered heavily, especially after strenuous exercise. Practical horsemen learned to allow an overheated animal to recover gradually. The details of horse care varied with conditions and experience, but the underlying principle was simple. Do not treat the animal like a machine. It was alive. It became tired. It became thirsty. It could become overheated. And its condition determined how safely the journey could continue. The same was true for cattle. A cattle drive was a moving system of living animals. The cowboys were responsible for maintaining that system. A tired herd could become difficult to control. Animals could scatter. They could refuse to move. They could become agitated during storms. They could seek water aggressively. So water was not only a personal concern, it was a herd concern. This explains why knowledge of water routes was so valuable. A trail might be remembered not by a road sign but by landmarks. A particular rock, a distant mountain, a grove of trees, a bend in a river, a spring hidden near a canyon. These landmarks formed a mental map. Long before satellite navigation, People navigated using landscape. For an experienced rider, the horizon contained information. The angle of a mountain ridge, the position of the sun, the shape of a valley, the direction of a river. Even the type of vegetation could offer clues. A patch of greener plants in an otherwise dry landscape might suggest underground moisture, but appearances could also deceive. A green area did not guarantee drinkable water. A dry-looking place did not necessarily mean there was none. The desert rewarded knowledge more than confidence. As the sun rises higher, your imagined journey continues. The coolness of the morning disappears. The horse begins to sweat. Your own shirt becomes damp beneath the layers. The saddle leather grows warm. The smell of dust becomes stronger. The horizon shimmers. There is still a long way to travel. And now another problem appears. Dust. Cattle produced clouds of it. Horses produced dust. Dry roads and trails produced dust. A moving herd could fill the air with fine particles. A cowboy might pull a bandana across his face. The cloth could help filter some dust and protect the mouth and nose from the worst of it. Dust also settled everywhere. On clothing, on saddles, on blankets, on food, in hair, between the pages of books or papers, inside equipment. The desert was not something you could simply leave outside. It followed you. Even after washing, dust returned. A cowboy's world was often dusty because his workplace was the ground itself. There was also the constant problem of sun exposure. Long-term exposure to intense sunlight could damage the skin. People in the 19th century did not have modern sunscreen products or modern understanding of ultraviolet radiation. Instead, they relied largely on clothing, hats, shade, and habits. A broad hat could be especially useful. The crown and brim created a small region of shade around the head and face. The shape of the hat varied according to region and maker. Some were influenced by Mexican sombrero traditions. Others developed from American hat styles. Eventually, certain wide-brimmed styles became strongly associated with the cowboy image. But the practical value came first. Shade was useful. Fashion came later. When the heat became strongest, the cowboy's world could become strangely quiet. Cattle might stand more closely together. Horses might seek whatever shade was available. Birds could become less active. The ground seemed to radiate warmth. A person might look across the landscape and see almost no movement. This stillness can be misleading. The desert was not empty. Small animals were hiding from the worst heat. Insects remained active in sheltered places. Plants were conserving moisture. The entire ecosystem had developed ways of coping with the same conditions. Humans were simply another species trying to manage the environment. One of the most important differences was that humans could plan. A cowboy could decide when to move. He could choose where to rest. He could carry water. He could wear protective clothing. He could build a fire. He could select a sheltered campsite. These decisions created a small layer of control in a landscape that otherwise offered very little. And that control began with observation. Imagine watching the sky for several minutes. There are clouds building far to the south. They're still distant. The air feels different. The wind changes. Perhaps rain will come. Perhaps it will pass somewhere else. A cowboy had to make decisions with incomplete information. Weather knowledge came from observation rather than forecasts. Cloud shapes, wind direction, temperature changes, thunder in the distance, changes in animal behavior. These could all provide clues. Some signs were reliable, others were not. Experience helped separate them. A storm could be welcome because it brought water, but it could also create problems. Rain could turn dry ground into mud. Lightning could threaten people and animals. Strong winds could damage temporary camps. Floodwater could suddenly fill normally dry channels. For cattle workers, storms could be particularly troublesome. A herd frightened by thunder could move quickly and unpredictably. Nighttime storms could make the job even harder. A cowboy might be trying to sleep when the weather changed. The fire could go out. Blankets could become wet. The horses could become restless. Cattle could begin moving. Then the worker had to get up. There was no guarantee that tomorrow would be comfortable. This uncertainty was part of the work. Yet the desert also offered beautiful moments. After rain, the smell of the earth could change. Dust settled. The air became clearer. Cloud shadows moved across the landscape. Dry washes could carry temporary water. Plants could respond quickly when moisture became available. The land could appear transformed for a short time. A cowboy who spent months in the same region would have seen these changes repeatedly. He would learn that the desert was not always brown and lifeless. It had seasons. It had cycles. It had brief periods of green. It had sudden flowers after rain. It had animals adapted to long, dry periods. It had its own form of abundance. But water remained the central limitation. This shaped settlements as much as it shaped individual journeys. Ranches needed reliable water. Towns needed reliable water. Railroads needed water. Mining camps needed water. People could not simply build anywhere they wished. The geography of the Southwest placed strong limits on where large populations could remain. For cattle ranching, water and grazing were especially important. The open range system depended on access to natural grass and water sources. Cattle could wander over large areas. Cowboys were employed to locate, move, and manage them. The work could involve long distances and difficult weather. But it was also seasonal. Spring could bring better grazing in some places. Summer could create heat and dryness. Winter could bring cold, snow, and difficult travel in higher elevations. The idea that the cowboy faced only heat is therefore incomplete. Some Western cattle workers experienced freezing conditions, snowstorms, and bitter winds. The high country could be especially cold. Elevation changed everything. A desert at lower elevation might have intense heat during the day. A nearby mountain region could have freezing nights and winter snow. The Southwest was not one climate. It was a collection of environments. That is why the cowboys' equipment had to be adaptable. A blanket was useful in many regions. A coat could become essential in winter. Gloves might be needed. Wet clothing could become dangerous in cold weather. And shelter mattered. A person who had spent the day sweating could become uncomfortable quickly after sunset if he remained in damp clothing. Changing or drying clothing could therefore be valuable when circumstances allowed. The body itself was constantly adjusting. During heat, blood flow to the skin increased and sweating helped cool the body. During cold, the body reduced heat loss through several physiological responses. But these systems had limits. No amount of toughness could eliminate the need for water in extreme heat. No amount of courage could eliminate the danger of severe cold. The cowboy survived not because his body was different from everyone else's. He survived because knowledge, equipment, animals, timing, and experience worked together. This is a quieter story than the legend, and in many ways it is more interesting, because the real skill was not dramatic. It was repetitive. Every morning, every afternoon, every evening. Check the horse, check the water, check the equipment, watch the sky, watch the cattle. Choose the next place carefully, then continue. The repetition itself became a form of survival. By late afternoon, the landscape begins to soften again. The sunlight loses some of its harshness. The shadows grow longer. The air is still warm, but breathing feels easier. The horse's pace becomes steady. The herd moves slowly across the land. You can smell dry grass beneath the stronger smell of dust. Far away, mountains turn darker as the sun lowers behind them. This is often the most beautiful part of the day. But the cowboy knows something that a visitor might not. The beautiful evening will not remain warm. Cold is coming, and preparation for the night begins before darkness arrives. A good campsite is chosen while there is still enough light to see. The cowboy looks for protection from wind. He considers the ground. He considers the location of the livestock. He considers access to water. He considers fuel for a fire. He considers the direction of the weather. There may be no perfect campsite. There is only the best available option. The bedroll is removed. The saddle is handled carefully. The horse is given attention. Food is prepared. The work becomes slower. The sounds of the day fade. And then the first stars appear. Once again, the desert begins its transformation. The heat leaves the ground. The air cools. The fire becomes the center of the camp, and the cowboy prepares to cross another cold night. The journey has not ended. It has simply changed its character. Tomorrow, the sun will return. The desert will become hot again. The horse will rise. The cattle will move. And the same quiet knowledge will guide them onward. For a cowboy living and working in this country, survival was not a single achievement. It was something practiced every day. And in the darkness beside the small fire, with the stars above and the cold earth beneath the bedroll, that truth becomes very simple. You do not conquer the desert. You learn its rhythm. And then, one morning at a time, you learn to travel with it. The night has settled over the camp once again. The fire has become a quiet glow, and the desert air has grown noticeably colder. You pull the blanket closer and listen. There is no traffic, no distant machinery, no electric lights beyond the small circle around the fire, only darkness, wind, and the occasional movement of an animal. For a moment, it is easy to imagine that the entire world has become still. But the cowboy's night is rarely completely empty. There are animals to watch, equipment to protect, weather to observe, and sometimes cattle to keep from wandering away. The work continues even after the sun disappears. This was particularly true during cattle drives. A large herd could not simply be left unattended for an entire night. Cattle could become restless. They could move because of weather, unfamiliar sounds, predators, insects, or other disturbances. Night riding therefore became part of the routine for some trail crews. A group of cowboys could take turns watching the herd, allowing others to sleep. The exact system varied according to the size of the herd, the number of workers, the terrain, and the circumstances. But the basic idea was simple. Someone had to remain alert. Picture yourself riding slowly around the edge of a sleeping herd. The moon may be bright enough to reveal the outlines of the cattle. Their bodies form dark shapes against the pale ground. Every so often, one animal lifts its head. Another shifts position. The herd makes a low, almost continuous sound. Your horse walks steadily beneath you. There is little need for speed. You are simply making a wide circle. The night air is cold against your face. The smell of cattle is stronger than it was during the day. A faint breeze carries the scent of dry vegetation. Far above, the stars seem unusually close. There is something peaceful about the scene. But the rider cannot completely relax. The herd must remain together. This is one of the strange contradictions of cowboy life. The work could be exhausting, yet many of its most important moments were quiet. A rider could spend an hour simply observing. Then, suddenly, a few cattle might begin moving. The rider responds. He turns the horse. He changes direction. He guides the animals back. There is no need for shouting. Small movements can be enough. The horse knows the work. The cattle know the pressure of the horse's presence. The herd slowly settles again. Then the rider continues. Hours pass. The stars move across the sky. The temperature falls. Eventually, the horizon begins to lighten. Morning returns. For a person who has spent the night outdoors, the first light can feel different. It is not merely beautiful. It is relief. The coldest part of the night is ending. Soon, the sun will warm the ground. But before that happens, there may be a short period when the desert feels almost painfully cold. This is one reason sleeping equipment mattered. A bedroll had to protect the body from the ground and the air. The blankets had to be thick enough for the season. In colder conditions, additional clothing might be worn while sleeping. There was no universal standard. A wealthy worker might have better bedding than a poorly paid ranch hand. A winter camp might require much more protection than a summer one. And the high country demanded different preparations from the low desert. Still, the principle remained the same. The body loses heat quickly when exposed to cold air and cold surfaces. Keeping warm was therefore a matter of creating layers. Clothing, blankets, ground insulation, shelter, fire. Each contributed something. A fire could warm the hands and face. A blanket could hold body heat. Shelter could block wind. The ground beneath the sleeper could be insulated with bedding. No single item had to do everything. Together, they created a tolerable sleeping environment. This idea of layers was not unique to cowboys. People everywhere who lived without modern heating had to understand it. The difference was that a cowboy might need to carry those layers on horseback. That made weight important. The equipment had to be compact. It had to survive repeated rolling, unrolling, tying, carrying, and exposure to weather. And it had to be useful. There was little reason to carry something that served only one purpose. The bedroll was therefore one of the most practical pieces of outdoor equipment. It represented a portable shelter. Not a tent in the modern sense. Not a bedroom. Just enough protection to let a person rest. When the weather was mild, that might be all that was needed. When conditions became severe, the situation was different. Cold rain was especially unpleasant. A person could remain uncomfortable even when the temperature was not extremely low. Wet clothing conducted heat away from the body more effectively than dry clothing. Wind made the problem worse. A cowboy caught outdoors in a cold storm could therefore face a serious challenge. The solution was often preparation rather than heroism. Keep the bedding as dry as possible. Protect important supplies. Find shelter when available. Avoid unnecessary exposure. Maintain a fire if conditions allow. These were ordinary actions. But ordinary actions became important when there was no building nearby. A storm could also change the desert floor. A dry trail might become muddy. A wash might carry water. A river crossing could become difficult. The cowboy had to think not only about the weather overhead, but also about what was happening across the landscape. A storm several miles away could affect the route. Rain falling upstream could create flooding downstream. This was particularly important in desert regions where dry channels could suddenly fill. A person unfamiliar with the region might see a dry wash and assume it was a safe place to camp. An experienced traveler understood that the situation could change. The desert was a place where absence of water could coexist with sudden flooding. That strange contradiction was part of the landscape. The same country that demanded careful conservation of water could sometimes become dangerous because of too much water arriving too quickly. Cowboys learned to watch for these patterns, but their knowledge was not always perfect. Historical people were not immune to mistakes. They could misjudge storms. They could underestimate distances. They could become lost. They could run short of water. They could suffer from heat exhaustion. They could become injured. The West was dangerous, partly because small errors could become serious when help was far away. This is another reason why experience was so valuable. A veteran trail worker had seen problems before. He might know when to stop. He might recognize a weak horse. He might know a particular trail was unreliable after rain. He might remember a spring that was hidden from casual view. He might understand where shade appeared in the afternoon. Experience turned landscape into information. A mountain was not simply a mountain. It could be a direction marker. A canyon was not simply a canyon. It might provide shelter. A cluster of trees might indicate water nearby. A dry ridge might offer better visibility. A rocky slope might block the wind. Every feature could become useful. This kind of practical geography was learned slowly. Sometimes it was taught. Sometimes it was copied from other workers. Sometimes it came through difficult experience. A young cowboy could learn quickly after making a mistake. The lesson might stay with him for years. The culture of Western cattle work was therefore built partly on accumulated practical knowledge. Much of it was never written down. It was carried through habits, a particular way of packing equipment, a particular way of handling a horse, a particular place to stop, a particular route between water sources. a particular method of protecting food from heat and animals. These small decisions rarely appear in dramatic stories, yet they were essential to daily life. Food itself had to survive the journey. Fresh meat was not always practical to carry for long periods in hot weather. Cowboys and other travelers relied on foods that could remain usable without modern refrigeration. Salted or cured meat could be carried. Dried foods were useful. Beans were practical. Hardtack and other durable bread products could be used. Coffee was popular among many Western workers. The chuck wagon became an important feature of many cattle drives, providing a mobile kitchen and supplies. Not every cowboy had access to the same food or cooking arrangements, but the principle was clear. Food had to be portable, it had to be reasonably durable, and it had to be prepared with limited equipment. Imagine the evening meal after a long day. The air has cooled. A pot sits near the fire. The smell of coffee rises with the smoke. There may be beans simmering. There may be meat. The meal is simple, but after hours in the saddle, simplicity can be comforting. A hot drink provides warmth. Food restores energy. The fire provides light. For a short time, the day's difficulties seem distant. The chuck wagon, where present, could serve as more than a kitchen. It was part of the mobile camp. It carried food and cooking equipment. It created a place around which workers gathered. The cook had an important role. A trail cook was responsible for preparing meals under difficult conditions. The work required organization. Supplies had to last. Meals had to be practical. The cook had to work in heat, cold, dust, and wind. Cooking itself could be physically demanding, and yet, around the fire at night, the smell of food could make the camp feel almost like home. That sense of routine mattered. Even far from towns, people created familiar patterns. Wake, work, eat, rest, repair, work again. The landscape might be unfamiliar, but routine gave the day structure. This was one of the quiet ways humans adapt to difficult environments. We create habits. Habits reduce uncertainty. They tell us what comes next. For a cowboy, that might mean checking the horse before breakfast, packing the bedroll after sunrise, checking the cattle, moving toward the next water source, resting during the hottest part of the day when possible, setting camp before darkness, preparing food, repairing equipment, sleeping, then beginning again. The desert became a place of repetition. But repetition did not mean boredom. The weather could change. The herd could change. The trail could change. The horse could change. The same landscape looked different under different light. Morning light made the rocks pale. Midday light flattened them. Evening light gave them long shadows. Moonlight turned familiar ground into something almost unfamiliar. A cowboy who spent months outdoors could develop a deep awareness of these changes. He learned to read the land almost subconsciously. This awareness also helped with navigation. Before reliable modern road networks and widespread motorized travel, orientation in remote areas depended on maps, landmarks, compasses, celestial observation, and local knowledge. The stars could help. The sun could help, but both required understanding. The position of the sun changes through the day and across seasons. Stars appear to move across the sky because of Earth's rotation. A person experienced in outdoor travel could use these patterns as part of navigation. But no single technique guaranteed safety. Maps could be inaccurate. Trails could disappear. Landmarks could be misunderstood. Clouds could obscure the sky. The best navigators combined several forms of information, and again, experience mattered. A cowboy could look across the land and recognize where he was. That ability could appear almost magical to an outsider. It was not magic. It was memory. The memory of mountains. The memory of water. The memory of trails. The memory of distances. The memory of how the land looked at different times of year. A landscape that seemed empty to a stranger could be full of landmarks to someone who knew it. This was especially important in desert country. When vegetation was sparse, distant terrain could become a natural map. A mountain range could guide a rider for days. A river could define a route. A canyon could create a passage. A line of trees could mark water. The desert was open, but it was not featureless. And then there was the question of shade. Shade was one of the simplest forms of protection from heat. But shade in the desert could be limited. A single tree might become extremely valuable. So might a rocky overhang, a canyon wall, the side of a wagon. Even the shadow of equipment could provide a small reduction in direct sunlight. A cowboy did not necessarily need a perfectly cool place. He needed enough relief to reduce the burden of the heat. Resting in shade could allow the body to recover. The horse benefited as well. If the herd was near water and shade, animals could stand quietly and reduce their activity. The landscape itself dictated where these opportunities existed. This meant that a cowboy's route was often shaped by environmental limits. The shortest route was not always the best route. A slightly longer path with water could be safer. A trail with better grazing could be more useful. A route with shelter from wind could be preferable in cold weather. Distance alone did not determine the quality of a trail. A route had to work for living bodies. This was particularly important when moving cattle. Cattle needed food and water. They could not be treated like cargo. A train could carry supplies without needing to stop for grass. A herd could not. The animals had to eat. That meant the land itself became part of the transportation system. Grass was fuel. Water was essential. The cowboy's task was to connect these resources. In this way, the trail was not simply a line across a map. It was a sequence of places where animals could survive. This also explains why drought could be devastating. If rain failed, grass became scarce. Water sources weakened. Cattle lost condition. Ranchers faced difficult decisions. Move animals. Reduce herds. Search for better grazing. Dig wells where possible. Change routes. The cowboy could not solve drought by working harder. The environment imposed limits. And those limits shaped the history of Western ranching. The romantic image of endless open range sometimes hides this uncertainty. Ranching was dependent on weather. A good year could bring abundant grass. A dry year could bring losses. A harsh winter could kill livestock. A flood could destroy a trail. A heat wave could weaken animals. Success depended partly on decisions and partly on forces beyond human control. The cowboy lived inside that uncertainty. Perhaps this is why patience became so important. You could prepare. You could observe. You could choose carefully. but you could never control the weather. As afternoon arrives again, the heat returns. The cycle continues. The sun rises higher. The shadows shorten. The horse's coat becomes warm. Dust settles on your boots. You take another drink of water. The amount remaining matters. You know where the next source should be. But you are still hours away. So the journey continues at a steady pace. There is no reason to rush. The horse walks. The cattle walk. The sun moves. The landscape seems endless. And somewhere beneath the quiet surface, the whole system is working. The horse is regulating its temperature. The cattle are seeking the easiest path. The plants are conserving moisture. The cowboy is watching everything. This is what adaptation looks like. Not a dramatic battle. Just thousands of small adjustments. A hat tilted against the sun. A horse slowed to a walk. A blanket folded beneath a sleeping body. A campsite chosen behind a rock. A fire kept small because fuel is limited. A water source remembered from years before. A meal cooked after sunset. A coat pulled tight before dawn. Each action is simple. Together they create a life that can continue. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is how ordinary it becomes. After enough months, a cowboy might stop thinking of desert heat as something extraordinary. It simply becomes part of the work. Cold becomes part of the work, too. The discomfort does not disappear. The body simply learns what to expect. The mind learns when to respond. The equipment becomes familiar. The horse becomes familiar. The landscape becomes familiar. And familiarity reduces fear. A strange place becomes a known place. A difficult trail becomes a remembered trail. A cold camp becomes a normal camp. A hot afternoon becomes another afternoon. This does not mean the environment becomes harmless. It means the person becomes better prepared. As the evening returns, the light begins to soften. The day's heat slowly drains away. The cowboy prepares for another night. The horse is settled. The equipment is checked. The bedroll is ready. The fire begins again. And once more, the desert becomes quiet. You lie beneath the wide western sky. The ground is cold. The blanket holds some warmth. The stars appear. For a moment, the long day seems to disappear. Tomorrow will bring another sunrise, another ride, another stretch of dry country, another search for water, another evening beside the fire. And perhaps that is the clearest way to understand how cowboys survived the desert. They did not survive one terrible day. They survived thousands of ordinary days. They learned the landscape. They learned their animals. They learned their equipment. They learned their own limits. And they learned to move with the changing temperature rather than expecting the desert to change for them. The night grows deeper. The fire becomes smaller. The wind passes gently across the open ground. And somewhere beyond the darkness, the first light of another morning is already waiting. The night is quiet now. The fire has burned down to a few glowing pieces of wood, and the warmth reaches only a small part of the camp. Beyond that circle of light, the desert is dark. The horses stand quietly. The cattle are resting. Above them, the stars continue their slow movement across the sky. You pull the blanket closer, and listen to the wind moving across the open land. It is difficult to imagine that only a few hours earlier, this same ground was hot enough to make every step uncomfortable. That contrast was one of the defining experiences of working in the dry country. The desert did not provide a steady temperature. It offered extremes, and those extremes affected almost every part of daily life. Sleep was no exception. For someone working outdoors, sleeping was not simply a matter of lying down. A person had to decide where to sleep, what to sleep on, what to sleep under, and how to protect the bedding from weather. The ground could be hard. Small stones could press through a thin blanket. Dust could settle into everything. Cold air could move underneath the bedding. Wind could disturb the camp. In some places, insects and other animals could also make nighttime uncomfortable. The bedroll was therefore an important piece of practical equipment. It was portable. It could be rolled tightly. It could be attached to a saddle or wagon. And when night came, it could be opened and turned into a temporary bed. The exact arrangement differed from person to person. Some workers had better bedding than others. Some carried more blankets. Some had canvas coverings. Some slept beneath the open sky when weather allowed. Others sought shelter whenever it was available. The popular image of a cowboy sleeping beside a campfire beneath the stars has some basis in reality, especially for people on the trail. But real working conditions were more varied. A cowboy might sleep in a bunkhouse. He might sleep in a ranch building. He might sleep in a wagon camp. He might sleep outdoors. His sleeping arrangement depended on the job. But when he was far from permanent shelter, the bedroll became a small piece of home. It was not comfortable in the modern sense. Yet after a long day in the saddle, even a simple blanket spread over the ground could feel welcome. Imagine lowering yourself onto the bedding after sunset. Your back is tired. Your legs have spent hours adjusting to the movement of the horse. Your hands smell faintly of leather and smoke. The air is cold against your cheeks. You pull the blanket over your shoulders. The fire gives a little warmth. The horse nearby breathes steadily. For a few minutes the day becomes quiet. Then the cold begins to settle deeper. The first lesson is that warmth is not only about the air, it is also about the ground. Cold ground can draw heat away from the body. This is why insulation beneath a sleeping person is important. A blanket under the body can help. A bedroll provides some separation. Dry vegetation, spare clothing, or other materials might also be used when available. The goal is simple: create a barrier. The cowboy did not have modern insulated sleeping pads. He had to improvise with the materials and equipment available to him. This is one of the recurring themes of historical outdoor life. People often solved problems with simple objects because there were no specialized alternatives. A blanket could become a mattress. A coat could become an extra layer. A saddle could provide a little support. A wagon could provide shelter from wind. A rock wall could become a windbreak. The solution did not have to be elegant. It had to work. And sometimes the best solution was simply choosing the right place. A campsite behind a natural barrier could feel completely different from one exposed to the open wind. Wind is especially important in cold weather. Moving air increases heat loss from the body. A person who feels reasonably comfortable in still air may become much colder when exposed to strong wind. so a cowboy looking for a campsite could consider the direction from which the wind was coming. A small change in position could make a noticeable difference. The side of a hill, the lee of a rock, a group of trees, a shallow depression. These were natural shelters. They did not stop the cold, but they could reduce the force of the wind. In a world without modern tents, such knowledge mattered. The same landscape that seemed harsh during the day could provide protection at night if you knew how to use it. This knowledge was not unique to cowboys. Indigenous peoples of the Southwest had long developed sophisticated ways of adapting to local climates. Their knowledge of seasonal weather, water, plants, terrain, and shelter had been built over many generations. European and American settlers entering the region did not arrive in an unknown land. They entered environments already understood by indigenous communities. Cowboys later adopted some practices and knowledge through interaction with people who knew the country well. The history of Western survival, therefore, belongs to many cultures. The cowboy became an iconic figure, but he was part of a much larger history of people learning how to live in difficult environments. As dawn approaches, the cold begins to loosen. The sky becomes lighter. The first birds call. The horses stir. A cowboy may rise before the sun has fully appeared. The fire is rebuilt. Coffee is prepared. The smell of smoke mixes with the cool morning air. This is another important part of the daily cycle. The morning meal does more than provide food. It provides warmth. Hot coffee became closely associated with cattle camps and trail life. Preparing it was part of the routine. The cook might begin work before everyone else was awake. Water was heated. Coffee was brewed. Food was prepared. The camp slowly came alive. A fire in the darkness could create a sense of comfort even before the sun rose. The people around it were still cold, but the day had begun. And soon, the temperature would begin climbing again. This daily temperature swing meant that clothing could be difficult to manage. The cowboy might begin the morning wearing several layers. As the sun rose, some layers would be removed. They might be tied to the saddle or packed away. By afternoon, the hat and shirt became the most important protection. After sunset, the coat returned. The same person could move through several different clothing arrangements in one day. This was practical layering long before modern outdoor clothing systems were developed. The difference was that the clothing was not necessarily designed specifically for temperature regulation. It was ordinary work clothing used intelligently. A wool garment could provide warmth. Cotton could be comfortable in hot weather, but had limitations when wet and cold. Leather offered protection from brush and wind. Canvas could be used for coverings and equipment. The materials available to working people depended on cost, location, and time period. Not everyone had the same resources. A ranch owner might afford better equipment than a low-paid hired hand. A worker might repair an old garment repeatedly rather than replace it. Clothing was valuable because it represented labor and money. A torn coat could become a serious problem during winter. A damaged boot could make riding painful. A broken saddle strap could interfere with the entire day's work. Repairing equipment was therefore part of survival. A cowboy might carry needles, thread, leather pieces, or simple tools. Some repairs could be done at camp. Others required a trip to a town or ranch. The farther away from civilization a worker traveled, the more valuable self-reliance became. But self-reliance did not mean doing everything alone. Cowboys depended on each other. A trail crew worked as a group. One rider could watch cattle while another repaired equipment. One person could prepare food while others handled animals. During dangerous weather, cooperation became even more important. A lone rider had fewer options. A group could share knowledge and divide responsibilities. This was especially true during long cattle drives. The famous cattle drives of the post-Civil War period could involve large herds and multiple workers. The exact number varied. Some drives involved hundreds of cattle. Others involved much larger herds. The work could last for weeks or months. During that time, the crew moved through changing environments. They crossed rivers. They passed through grasslands. They traveled through dry regions. They encountered storms. They faced heat. They sometimes encountered cold. The journey was not simply a long ride. It was a moving community. The chuck wagon carried supplies. The cook prepared food. Cowboys managed cattle. Leaders decided routes and daily movements. Animals carried equipment. Everything depended on everything else. If a wagon broke, the journey slowed. If horses became exhausted, the work became harder. If cattle lost condition, the value of the herd could suffer. If water was unavailable, the entire route might have to change. The environment shaped the decisions. The cowboy was not controlling the land. He was negotiating with it. That is a useful way to understand the work. Negotiation. The sun said, "Slow down." The cowboy adjusted. The land said, "Water is far away." The cowboy planned. The wind changed. The camp moved. The temperature fell. The blanket came out. The horse became tired. The pace changed. This constant adjustment allowed the work to continue. There was another challenge that is often forgotten: altitude. Much of the American West contains high plateaus, mountains, and elevated valleys. At higher elevations, nights could become very cold, even when the daytime sun felt strong. Thin air and intense sunlight could also make daytime exposure feel different. A cowboy working in the high country might encounter snow in places where someone at lower elevation experienced dry desert conditions. This made regional knowledge essential. The phrase, "the desert," can create the impression of one uniform environment. It was not. The Sonoran Desert was different from the Mojave. The Chihuahuan Desert was different from the Great Basin. High desert country differed from low desert country. Rainfall patterns differed. Plants differed. Elevation differed. Winter conditions differed. Even within one region, weather could vary from valley to mountain. A cowboy who worked in one area learned that area's particular habits: where water appeared, where grass grew, where snow accumulated, where storms came from, where the wind was strongest, where cattle tended to gather. These details formed an invisible map. The cowboy carried that map in memory. Sometimes he also carried a physical map. But memory was often just as important. A person could remember a particular spring because he had used it many times. He could remember a narrow pass because he had crossed it before. He could remember a dangerous river crossing because of an earlier storm. The landscape became connected to personal experience. A rock could remind him of a difficult journey. A tree could remind him of a camp. A mountain could tell him how close he was to the next destination. This connection between memory and landscape made travel possible, and it helped people recognize when something was wrong. A familiar landscape that suddenly looked different might indicate weather. A stream that was usually shallow might be higher. Grass that was normally green might be dry. A spring might be weaker. A trail might have disappeared. Small changes mattered. The cowboy's eyes were constantly working. Even while riding quietly, he was gathering information. That observation was one of the hidden skills of the job. The cowboy did not need to stare at the ground every second. He learned to notice without interrupting the rhythm of riding. The horse's ears moved. The cattle shifted. A cloud appeared. A bird flew low. The wind changed. The rider noticed. The journey continued. By late morning, the temperature is climbing again. The desert begins to shimmer. You adjust your hat. Your horse walks beneath the bright sun. The herd moves slowly ahead. There is no hurry. The landscape seems almost motionless, but the body is working. Every movement costs energy. Every breath moves warm air in and out. Every drop of sweat carries water away. This is where water management becomes especially important. A cowboy's water supply had to be protected from waste. There was no guarantee of another source nearby. A canteen was valuable because it represented future ability. The water inside was not simply for the present moment. It might be needed later. That required restraint. Yet drinking too little could also be dangerous. The goal was not to refuse water. The goal was to use it intelligently. Experienced workers learned their own needs through practice. They also learned the signs of trouble. Severe thirst, weakness, headache, dizziness, confusion, loss of coordination. These could indicate serious heat stress or dehydration. People in the 19th century did not use modern medical terminology in the same way we do today, but they understood that heat could make a person sick. They knew that a person could collapse. They knew that animals could suffer, and they knew that shade and rest could matter. There was no modern emergency response waiting nearby. If someone became seriously ill far from settlement, the group had to respond with whatever knowledge and resources they had. This made prevention especially valuable. Do not let the problem become severe if you can avoid it. That principle applied to horses as well. A horse showing signs of exhaustion needed rest. A horse that had worked hard under intense heat could not simply be pushed indefinitely. The animal was central to the cowboy's livelihood. A good horse represented value. It also represented trust. Cowboys developed strong working relationships with their horses. They learned which animals were calm, which were energetic, which were stubborn, which were sure-footed, which handled cattle well. The horse became an extension of the rider's work. A cowboy could guide cattle partly through the horse's movement. This reduced the amount of physical effort required from the rider. The horse did some of the thinking. It watched cattle. It responded to movement. It anticipated turns. A skilled cattle horse could work almost automatically. That made long hours in the saddle more manageable. But the relationship had limits. A horse still needed food, water, rest, and care. The cowboy's survival was tied to the animal's survival. This created a practical form of respect, not necessarily sentimental in the modern sense, but deeply functional. A neglected horse could become a dangerous horse. A well-cared-for horse could carry a worker through difficult country. The difference mattered. As afternoon approaches, the heat reaches its strongest point. The cowboy looks for shade. Perhaps there is a tree. Perhaps a rocky ledge. Perhaps there is only the narrow shadow of the wagon. The rest period begins. The horse stands quietly. The cattle gather where conditions allow. The wind is warm. There is very little sound. You drink. You eat something simple. You check the saddle. You check your boots. You look over the horse. This pause may last only a short time, but it restores energy. The work will resume later. There is no need to waste strength during the hottest part of the day if the situation allows a slower pace. This is another example of how the cowboy's schedule could be shaped by the environment. Modern people sometimes think of productivity as constant activity. Outdoor workers have always understood something different. Sometimes, stopping is part of working. Rest is not the opposite of work. It allows work to continue. For a cowboy, a short pause could prevent a much longer problem. The afternoon eventually begins to cool. The shadows stretch. The horse moves again. The cattle follow. And the landscape opens toward the evening. The sun turns lower. The air smells different. There may be a faint coolness coming from the surrounding hills. The day's tension begins to fade. But the cowboy is already thinking about night. The firewood must be considered. The campsite must be chosen. The bedding must be protected. The animals must be settled. If the night is expected to be cold, shelter becomes more important. If rain is possible, bedding needs protection. If wind is likely, the campsite needs a barrier. The work of surviving tomorrow begins before today is finished. This is one of the reasons experienced workers seemed calm in difficult conditions. They were thinking ahead. They did not wait for the cold to arrive before finding a place to sleep. They did not wait until the water was gone before thinking about the next source. They did not wait until the horse collapsed before considering rest. Preparation reduced emergencies. And preparation often looked like nothing at all. A person simply made a choice earlier. That choice might not be remembered, but it mattered. As the last sunlight touches the hills, the temperature begins to fall. The desert changes again. The same rocks that were warm now become cool. The wind becomes sharper. The cowboy reaches for his coat. The bedroll is ready. The fire is started. Another night is approaching, and with it comes another lesson. The desert does not ask whether you prefer heat or cold. It gives you both. You learn to carry what you need for each. You learn to adapt. You learn to listen. You learn to wait. The fire grows brighter for a while. Coffee warms the hands. The horses settle. The cattle become quiet. Above the camp, the first stars appear. And once again, the vast night opens overhead. The day's heat has disappeared. The cold begins its slow arrival. You pull the blanket around yourself. The wind moves across the ground. The fire crackles softly. There is nothing left to prove. The work of the day is finished. For now. Tomorrow will bring the sun again, and the cowboy will rise with it. The night is deep now. The fire has become a quiet bed of embers, glowing softly beneath a layer of ash. The horses are resting. The cattle have settled into the darkness. Above the camp, the stars stretch across the sky in a way that is difficult to imagine from a modern city. There are no bright buildings nearby, no headlights passing on a distant road, no electric lights washing away the darkness, only the quiet land and the cold. You pull the blanket closer. For the moment, there is nowhere else to go. This is where the journey has brought you. A small camp somewhere in the vast American West. The desert around you has survived countless nights like this. And the people who worked across it learned to do the same. Not by defeating the cold, not by defeating the heat, but by understanding the rhythm between them. That rhythm is the real story. A cowboy's life was often described later as a life of freedom. There was some truth in the feeling of open space, but freedom came with responsibility. A rider could travel far from towns and roads, but he still depended on water. He depended on his horse. He depended on his equipment. He depended on the weather. He depended on other people. And he depended on his own judgment. The wide landscape offered space, but it did not offer unlimited safety. Every journey required decisions: where to stop, when to move, how much water to carry, how hard to work the horse, where to sleep, what clothing to wear, when to rest. These decisions were rarely dramatic. Most of them took only a few seconds, but together they determined whether a long journey remained manageable. This is perhaps why the historical cowboy was different from the character later created by popular entertainment. The real working cowboy did not spend every day in a dramatic confrontation. Much of his life involved repetition, riding, watching, waiting, repairing, eating, sleeping, moving cattle, searching for water, preparing camp, then doing it again. The landscape might be enormous, but the daily routine was often surprisingly simple, and simplicity was useful. When conditions were difficult, complicated systems were harder to maintain. A person learned a few reliable habits and repeated them. The horse was checked, the saddle was tightened, the water was counted, the cattle were watched, the weather was observed, the bedroll was kept dry, the fire was managed. Morning came. Work began. This rhythm could continue for weeks, sometimes months. And over time, the environment became familiar. The desert was no longer simply a place of heat. It became a collection of remembered places: a spring beneath a rocky slope, a patch of grass beside a stream, a canyon where the wind was weaker, a tree that gave afternoon shade, a hill that marked the route, a place where cattle had once scattered, a campsite where a winter storm had been endured. The land became a kind of memory. A cowboy could carry knowledge of it without carrying a book. That knowledge could be passed to another worker. An older cowboy might show a younger one where water could be found. He might explain how to approach a difficult crossing. He might teach him how to handle a horse. He might teach him how to recognize signs of fatigue. He might teach him where not to camp. This was practical education. There was no classroom. The landscape was the classroom. The horse was part of the lesson. The weather was part of the lesson. Mistakes were often the most memorable teachers. A young worker who spent too much energy during the hottest part of the day might remember the experience for years. A rider who failed to protect his bedding from rain might never make the same mistake again. A person who underestimated a distant water source learned to plan more carefully. The knowledge accumulated, One generation taught another, and the work continued. It is easy to think of survival as something extraordinary, but the history of everyday survival is often much quieter. People survive because they know what to do. They notice small problems before those problems become large. They prepare, they adapt, they rest, they cooperate, they accept limits. The cowboy's ability to live through desert heat and nighttime cold was built from these ordinary skills. Consider the hat, a simple object. Yet during a long day beneath an intense sun, the shade it provided could be valuable. Consider the blanket, just a piece of fabric and insulation. But at night, when temperatures fell, it could become essential. Consider the canteen. Small compared with the desert around it, but its contents could determine how long a rider could safely remain away from water. Consider the horse, a living animal with its own limits. Yet without it, much of the work became far more difficult. Each item was part of a larger system. Nothing worked alone. This is especially clear when we think about water. A cowboy needed water for himself. The horse needed water. The cattle needed water. Cooking required water. Cleaning sometimes required water. Water was therefore connected to almost every part of life. Its scarcity influenced routes, camps, settlements, ranches, and the movement of livestock. The Great Western cattle trails were shaped partly by the geography of water. A trail that crossed too much dry country without reliable sources could become dangerous. A route beside rivers or springs could support larger movements. This is why the map of Western cattle movement cannot be separated from the map of Western water. The land decided what was possible. People learned to work within those limits. And then there was grass. Water alone was not enough for cattle. They needed grazing. The availability of grass changed with seasons and rainfall. A dry year could reduce the carrying capacity of the range. Cattle could lose weight. Ranchers could lose money. Cowboys might have to move animals farther. This created another form of environmental pressure. The cowboy did not simply guide cattle across empty space. He was constantly moving living animals through a landscape whose resources changed. A good route had to provide both water and food. That made geography essential. The cowboy became a traveler, herder, observer, and caretaker all at once. His work could be physically demanding, but it also required attention. A person could not simply sit on a horse and let the animal do everything. He had to notice. That word matters. Notice. Notice the horse's breathing. Notice the cattle drifting away. Notice the clouds. Notice the wind. Notice the water level. Notice the condition of the trail. Notice how much daylight remained. Notice how cold the evening was becoming. Observation allowed action. Action prevented problems. And prevention was one of the greatest forms of survival. As the centuries passed, technology changed. Railroads reduced the need for some long cattle drives. Fencing changed the open range. Motor vehicles eventually transformed ranch work. Weather information became more accessible. Modern clothing became available. Insulated sleeping equipment became common. Reliable water systems expanded. The cowboy's relationship with the environment changed. But the old lessons did not disappear completely. Ranch workers still have to think about heat. Horses still need water. Livestock still suffer from extreme temperatures. Weather can still change quickly. People working outdoors still need shade, hydration, proper clothing, rest, and planning. The technology may change. The basic relationship between the human body and the environment does not. Heat still demands water. Cold still demands insulation. Wind still removes heat. Sunlight still warms the body. Animals still have limits. The desert still follows its own rhythm. This is why the historical story remains useful. It reminds us that the human body has always needed protection. The cowboy was not immune to the weather. He simply lived in a time when he had to understand it more directly. A modern traveler can check a forecast on a phone. A 19th century writer might look at the sky. A modern traveler can carry an insulated sleeping bag. A cowboy carried blankets. A modern traveler can follow a marked road. A cowboy might follow a trail remembered from experience. The tools changed. The need for preparation did not. And perhaps that is why the image of the cowboy beneath the stars continues to feel so powerful. It represents a moment when human beings were physically close to the environment. You could feel the temperature changing. You could smell rain before it arrived. You could hear wind moving across dry grass. You could see clouds gathering over distant mountains. You could watch the stars without artificial light. The world was not separated into indoor and outdoor spaces as completely as it is for many people today. The environment was always present. It touched your clothing. It entered your camp. It shaped your work. It shaped your sleep. It shaped your route. It shaped your decisions. For the cowboy, weather was not background scenery. It was part of the job. And perhaps the most peaceful part of this story is the way the day eventually ends. The heat fades. The animals settle. The fire burns. The stars appear. The cowboy lies down. There is no guarantee of perfect comfort. There is only enough preparation to make rest possible. The blanket is pulled close. The hat rests nearby. The saddle and equipment wait for morning. The horse stands quietly. The cold air moves across the ground. And slowly, sleep comes. Hours later, the eastern sky begins to brighten. As the morning slowly arrives, the cold reaches its final moments. The cowboy wakes. The fire is stirred. Coffee begins again. The horse is saddled. The bedroll is rolled. The camp disappears into the morning landscape. From a distance, almost nothing remains. A few footprints, some hoofprints, cold ashes, a place where people slept. Then the riders move on. The sun rises higher. The desert becomes warm. The trail continues. This is the rhythm we have followed from the beginning. Heat, rest, cold, sleep, morning, then heat again. The cowboy survived by learning this rhythm rather than resisting it. He used shade when the sun was strong. He used clothing when the air was cold. He rested when the heat demanded it. He watched the horse. He protected water. He chose camps carefully. He repaired equipment. He learned the landscape. He depended on other people. And he accepted that the environment would always have the final word. There is something deeply human in that. We often imagine survival as strength. But strength alone is not enough. Survival is also attention. It is patience. It is preparation. It is knowing when to move and when to stop. It is understanding that the smallest decision can matter when conditions are difficult. The cowboy's life in the desert was built from these small decisions. A hat placed correctly, a blanket kept dry, a horse given time to rest, a water source remembered, a storm noticed before it arrived, a campsite chosen before darkness, a fire kept alive through the cold. None of these things sound extraordinary, but together they made life possible. And now, the imagined journey is coming to an end. The morning light is spreading across the desert. The hills are turning gold. The air is still cool, but the coming warmth can already be felt. The horse stands ready. The cattle begin to move. The trail lies ahead. For a moment, you look back at the place where you spent the night. The fire is gone. The blankets are packed. The ground shows only a few marks. Soon even those will disappear beneath dust and wind. The desert will remain. Quiet. Wide. Patient. It will continue through another hot afternoon, another cold night, another sunrise. And somewhere along the trail, another rider will learn the same lessons. The land does not need to be conquered. It needs to be understood. So you turn toward the morning. The horse begins to walk. The rhythm is gentle, hoof after hoof. The cattle follow. The sun rises. The air warms. The long shadows slowly shorten, and the journey continues beneath the enormous western sky. Perhaps that is the simplest truth behind the old stories of cowboys in the desert. They were not people who never felt the heat. They were not people who never felt the cold. They were ordinary human beings who learned how to live with both. They carried water. They carried blankets. They carried food. They carried tools. But most importantly, they carried knowledge. Knowledge of animals. Knowledge of weather. Knowledge of distance. Knowledge of the land. And knowledge of their own limits. That knowledge traveled with them from one sunrise to the next. The sun could be harsh. The night could be cold. The wind could change. The trail could disappear. But with preparation, patience, and experience, the journey could continue. And so the final image is not one of danger. It is one of quiet movement. A rider traveling across an open landscape. A horse walking steadily beneath him. Cattle moving slowly in the distance. Morning light spreading across dry hills. The smell of dust warming beneath the sun. The sound of hooves becoming softer as the distance grows. Behind them is another night. Ahead is another day. And between the two is the timeless rhythm of the desert. Heat gives way to evening. Evening gives way to cold. Cold gives way to dawn. Dawn gives way to heat again. The cycle continues. And the cowboy moves with it. Slowly. Patiently. 1 mile at a time. One night at a time. One sunrise at a time.